a century, the flattest shooting quarter-inch cartridge in America had no factory behind it, no name on a box, and no company willing to make the brass. Hunters who wanted it had to build it themselves. Then, in 1969, the year men walked on the moon, Remington stamped its own name on 50 years of other men's work and sold it back to the country as something new. That is the part the catalogue never printed. Not because Remington stole a design in the dead of night, the truth is slower and in its way more damning than theft. It is the story of how a cartridge can be perfected by dozens of hands across 5 decades and enter history under the name of the one company that showed up at the end with a factory. The cartridge is the 25-06. Today it sits in gun safes from Montana to Georgia. It shoots flat, it kicks lightly, and it kills deer and antelope at ranges where most of its contemporaries ran out of answers. Ask a hunter who made it, and the honest answer is not one man, but a chain of them, stretching back to before the First World War. Start with the man who drew the first line. Charles Newton was not a gunsmith. He was a lawyer from Western New York, a firearm enthusiast with an engineer's mind and a lawyer's stubbornness, and he understood chamber pressure and case geometry the way a structural man understands load. Before he ever touched the 30-06, he had already given American shooters 2 cartridges that mattered. His work led to the .22 Savage High Power, and then to the .250 3000 Savage, which in 1915 became the first American commercial cartridge to break 3,000 feet per second. Newton had credentials, and he had earned every one. Around 1912, he looked at the 30-06 military case and saw capacity going to waste. The case was strong, the geometry was sound, and the brass was available in quantity because the American military ran on it. He necked it down to take a quarter-inch bullet and recognized immediately what the combination produced. He called it the 25 Newton Special, the verified forerunner of what would eventually become the 25-06 Remington. The idea was correct. The case worked. The geometry was sound. What Newton had in his hands in 1912 was the essential premise of a cartridge that 57 years later would carry someone else's name on the box. But the popular telling runs ahead of the record here. Newton Special soon evolved into a different cartridge, the .256 Newton of 1913. And it appears almost no rifles were ever built by Newton in that original .25 caliber configuration. His premise was sound, and it was his. But he did not hand the world a finished cartridge ready for production. He handed it a blueprint, then moved on to a whole family of high-velocity designs that were 20 years ahead of the powder available to feed them. That timing broke him. Newton built companies to sell his rifles, and the First World War and then the Depression pulled the ground out from under each one. He died in New Haven, Connecticut, on the 9th of March, 1932, in his early 60s, having watched his fingerprints reach the market again and again under other names. His exact birth year is disputed in the record. A small, fitting irony for a man history kept slightly out of focus. What is not disputed is that he drew the first line, and that he was gone long before anyone made money from it. What Newton left was not a dead end, it was an open door, and the next man walked through it with a working shop and a paying trade. Adolf Otto Niedner of Dowagiac, Michigan, was a professional gunsmith with a reputation for precision work and a serious understanding of what the 30-06 case geometry could deliver in configurations the factory market had not touched. In 1920, he began chambering rifles for a quarter bore on the .06 case. His chamber dimensions retained the 17.5-degree shoulder angle from the parent case, a geometry the wildcatting world recognized as correct and kept largely unchanged for the next 50 years. The wildcatting community came to call the cartridge the 25 Niedner, and that name held for nearly 5 decades. was not a hobby. Niedner Arms was a real commercial gunsmithing operation with a named product and a paying customer base of serious hunters and reloaders, men who understood what this cartridge offered that the factory catalogue did not. The established commercial options in the quarter-inch bore class were modest. The 25-35 Winchester was a lever-action round with limited reach. The .257 Roberts, which Remington would commercialize in 1934, was loaded to pressures so conservative the cartridge never delivered what the case was capable of. Against those alternatives, what Niedner was building represented a genuine performance advantage. He built rifles for it and sold them, and he was not waiting for anyone's permission. But Niedner had help he did not ask for from the United States government. During the First World War, Frankfurt Arsenal had itself developed an experimental quarter bore on the aught 6 case, and after the war, surplus military rifles and brass flowed to civilians through the government marksmanship programs. Suddenly, the parent case was everywhere and cheap, and independent gunsmiths across the country began experimenting with it. The 25 Niedner was the most prominent version of an idea that a whole generation of tinkerers was now chasing at once. There was a catch that held the cartridge back for 2 decades, and Niedner understood it from the start. The aught 6 case is large in relation to a quarter-inch bullet overbore, in the language of the trade, and it wants a slow-burning powder to use all that capacity without spiking pressure. In 1920, that powder did not exist in the civilian market. Barrel life was short, pressures ran high before the case was fully utilized, and the cartridge performed on promise more than delivery. Niedner built for it anyway, because even operating within those constraints, the 25 Niedner outperformed what his customers could buy at any sporting goods counter. What finally freed the cartridge was not anything a gun company did, it was chemistry. IMRA 4350 arrived in 1940, and after the Second World War, quantities of surplus powder. Described in period hand-loading accounts as having the slow-burn characteristics the aught 6 case had always needed, reached the civilian market at prices that made extended real-world testing practical. For the first time, the case had propellant properly matched to its capacity. Pressures flattened. Barrel life improved. The velocities that men like Niedner had been reaching toward for 2 decades finally became achievable in a carefully assembled handload. Now, the cartridge worked the way its builders had always said it would. The practical field consequence was significant. For a hunter working the open terrain of the American West, across canyon country, high parks, and the long descents into river drainages where the shot can come at any distance, the 25-06 case offered a trajectory and a retained energy figure that the factory lineup of the post-war era could not match without stepping up to a cartridge that hit the shoulder considerably harder. The .270 Winchester was the standard bearer for flat-shooting Western hunting rifles in this period. Against a comparable factory .270 load, a well-built 25-06 handload drove a lighter bullet at competitive velocity with measurably less felt recoil. The difference mattered most in field conditions. No bench, cold fingers, shooting light that closes faster than you expect. A scattered but serious community of handloaders spent the post-war years documenting that, season by season, on mule deer and pronghorn across Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana. They were not publishing in the glossy national magazines, which had commercial relationships with the ammunition companies whose factory cartridges these Wildcatters were outperforming. They were trading load data through letters, club bulletins, and hand-loading society publications that the major advertising departments never read. The knowledge was real, verified across multiple seasons in multiple states, and it accumulated steadily out of sight of the market. The cartridge had a serious professional advocate in Townsend Whalen, a retired United States Army colonel with a documented record in long-range precision shooting that the serious hunting press respected. Whalen had been writing about the aught 6 case's quarter-bore potential for years, and his name carried weight with the audience that understood what he was describing. By the late 1950s, the cartridge had field-proof, published advocacy and a community of experienced handloaders who had verified each other's data across multiple seasons. It was, by every measure that mattered ballistically, a proven cartridge. Remington did none of that work. And that is the quiet center of this story. What the cartridge lacked was not proof, it had 50 years of that. What it lacked was the one thing only a factory could provide: commercially loaded ammunition available to a hunter who did not handload. That limitation kept it a wildcat, regardless of how thoroughly the shooting community had proven the concept. A man who bought his ammunition at a sporting goods counter simply could not use it. That is the specific problem Remington solved, and it is worth stating that fact clearly before characterizing what they did with it. In 1969, Remington ran the Wildcat through the industry standardization process, locked in one official set of dimensions out of the several slightly different versions the Wildcatters had been running for decades, and put it into commercial production as the 25-06 Remington. The dimensions they certified were essentially the ones the Wildcatters had been using since 1920, rooted in the same geometry Newton had sketched as the 25 Newton Special more than half a century earlier. The Model 700 was chambered for it the same year, and the cartridge that a generation of handloaders had built from surplus brass and carefully chosen powder was suddenly available in a factory box at any sporting goods counter in America. The commercial reception confirmed what the Wildcatters had known all along. Winchester chambered the Model 70 for it. Ruger followed. Every major bolt-action manufacturer eventually offered it, and the hunting press that had ignored 50 years of hand-loading evidence began running features on Remington's exciting new cartridge. The 25-06 fit the American hunting rifle market as though it had always been there. Because it had. The country had a 50-year head start on understanding how to shoot it. Remington charged for the ammunition. The men who built what was inside the case received nothing from that transaction, and nothing from the millions that followed. Reputable sources in the hunting press are careful to note that putting the company name on a standardized Wildcat was not Remington claiming to have invented it. SARMI certification is a technical and commercial service, not a declaration of authorship. But service is not creation, and in the retelling, that distinction dissolved completely. The name on the box was Remington's. The names of the men who spent 50 years making the thing worth boxing. Newton, Niedner, Whalen, and the uncredited handloaders of the post-war West appeared nowhere a customer would ever read. That is not villainy. It is simply how the industry has always worked. A wildcatter builds something at his own cost, with no promise anyone beyond his circle will ever acknowledge the effort. The proof accumulates in correspondence and small publications the national press does not read. When the concept is completely proven, not by the company's money, but by the tinkerer's time and brass and burned-out barrels, a manufacturer arrives with factory scale, applies its brand, and enters the market as the originator. The gun press, tied to that company by advertising, follows the framing. It is legal, it is ordinary, and it erases people with quiet efficiency. Newton received nothing. He was dead before his idea reached a factory catalogue. Niedner earned the right to have the cartridge carry his name for 50 years, and that name appears on no box any hunter has ever purchased. Whalen received respect in the handloading press and nothing that paid. The post-war handloaders who cross-checked each other's data across Wyoming and Colorado and Montana got not even a footnote. Remington itself filed for bankruptcy in 2020. The ammunition brand passed to new owners who acquired the name much the way Remington had acquired the cartridge, by being positioned to do so when the moment came, regardless of who had done the building. The company that standardized the 25-06 is gone in the form that did the standardizing. The cartridge the Wildcatters built is still there. Newton, Niedner, Wellen, they built something good enough that a corporation wanted to put its name on it. That is not failure. That is the only kind of victory available to a Wildcatter, and they earned it completely. The cartridge those men proved across 50 years of seasons will be doing the work this fall, the same as it has been since 1920, long before any factory decided to take credit. It will be in the hands of hunters who never heard of the 25 Newton Special, who never read Niedner's name, and who will never know that the round they are trusting on a cold Wyoming morning was debugged across 2 generations before Remington ever touched a single case. That is the part the catalog still does not print. And that is the part worth knowing.